Hi everyone. In this lecture we're going to be talking about research ethics, conducting research with minoritized and vulnerable groups, and then we'll just touch briefly on evidence-based practice. But we'll start with research ethics. So a couple of terms to know real quick, and those terms are beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. I know that first term, beneficence, is kind of a mouthful, but the root of beneficence is benefit, and the way to remember sort of the definition of beneficence is that the benefits must outweigh the risks. So the benefits of a research study must outweigh the risks, the potential risks of a research study. Justice is the second sort of ethical principle of research, and that principle states that the people participating in research are the people who will benefit. We can't exploit groups. We can't use vulnerable groups so that we are benefiting, say, other people. And then the respect for persons principle is basically the informed consent. People have to know what's going on, know what's expected of them, have full and complete knowledge of the study. We're going to talk a little bit more about informed consent here in a second, but these three principles apply sort of to all research, not just social work research, but research done in sort of all biomedical domains. And believe it or not, there actually was a point when there really was not a such thing as research ethics. The two sort of big things in history that predicated a movement towards research ethics were the atrocities committed during World War II. Part of the atrocities were medical experiments. And then in the United States, the Tuskegee syphilis study was sort of the other impetus for establishing a framework for biomedical research ethics. Part of the task for this week is to watch a short documentary. It's about 50 minutes long on Tuskegee, and that gives sort of a good background on why we have these three principles. The big well, Tuskegee violated all three of these principles, and these principles were created in the wake of Tuskegee. But the thing that Tuskegee really sort of illustrates is that is sort of that exploitation principle. So the poor African American sharecroppers in the South were exploited for putative gains in knowledge, and we determined after the fact that that was actually wrong and actually a fairly heinous thing to do. So that, like I said, really predicated the move towards research ethics. But let's talk about informed consent. So things you can't do in informed consent are bribery, deception, and other forms of coercion. So it's probably not appropriate for to offer, say, extra credit to participate in research. Now, people do pay. They do pay people for their time, and that's okay. That's not a form of coercion or bribery. If someone were compensated just an exorbitant amount of money for the time it took them to participate in a research study, that might be considered bribery or coercion. But oftentimes, the compensation is very modest. Sort of $15 or $20 an hour, maybe more, depending on kind of what's asked of someone. And that's a level that's sort of not regarded as coercive or with sort of undue influence. So there's a whole bunch of sort of elements of informed consent. You have to disclose that it's a research study, that participation is voluntary. There has to be sort of the names and contact information of the principal investigators, and then they'll also cover the purposes of the research study. They'll cover the procedures, how long participation will take, any risks or potential harms that someone could be expected to encounter, any safeguards to minimize those risks, any benefit. One of the benefits is always sort of the ability to contribute to the greater good or public health or something like that. And people often derive satisfaction from sort of doing something good. Informed consent includes a description of the incentive, if there is one, alternative procedures or courses of treatment, if there are any there, confidentiality issues are often talked about. Any restrictions on confidentiality. Most researchers are mandated reporters, and that would especially be true for social work researchers as well. So, in times of where we were concerned about abuse, we would have to break confidentiality at that point, and then any monetary compensation. They also will informed consent should talk about contact information for IRB staff and sort of the group that's responsible for monitoring research at a particular institution, and then that the participant is able to keep a copy of that in signed consent form. Why is it that you need to know about this? Well, for the capstone, it is entirely possible that you're going to be doing interactions with people, and so there may need to be an informed consent form of some kind. Now, although this stuff sounds like a lot, these 16 principles sound like a lot, it actually can be done very, very sort of efficiently. And most informed consent forms that I've seen lately are about a page, sort of a standard 8.5 by 11. So the idea is not to scare people or intimidate them with sort of legalese and things like that, but to give them the information so that they can make kind of an informed decision about whether or not they're going to participate. So let's talk about anonymity versus confidentiality real quick. So, in an anonymous framework, you're not collecting any information that could be used to identify a person. So, no names, no email addresses, phone numbers, home addresses, that kind of thing. Things like gender and religious affiliation and age, those are demographic things. Those aren't really considered identifying characteristics. So you can still collect that information kind of in an anonymous framework. In a confidential research study, you're collecting identifying information, so a person's name or a phone number or something like that. And oftentimes you're doing that because you want to connect their information to other information that's specific to that person. But of course, in a when you're maintaining confidentiality, you're not disclosing that information. You're not reporting it to authorities. You're not giving it to a credit agency. There, frankly, is no reason to most of the time in research. So my general sort of heuristic is if I can make a study anonymous, then I do it anonymously. If for some reason, though, maybe I'm doing a longitudinal study and I need to connect a person's information, that I'm collecting today with something that I'm going to collect, 6 months or a year from now, oftentimes I have to do it confidentially. And so if I can do it anonymously, I will. But if need be, I do it sort of confidentially. And of course, there's lots of steps that we take to ensure anonymity and confidentiality. We encrypt data files. Only certain people, like researchers and research assistants, graduate assistants, that kind of thing, actually have access to the data. It's not disseminated, and certainly a person's name or something like that would never appear in a journal article or a presentation or a product or something like that. In the rare instances where we have had to break confidentiality, we actually follow the same procedures that any clinician would follow. You're typically calling a hotline because you have concerns about child abuse or elder abuse or something like that. But that doesn't happen often, and it actually doesn't happen a whole lot in clinical practice either. Although that depends a little bit on the domain that you're working in. So let me just say one more thing about anonymity and confidentiality here. Where researchers are afforded anonymity and confidentiality because it's in the greater good. It's in the interest of sort of the public to be able to collect information anonymously and or confidentially, so that we can advance science and advance health and social justice and things like that. So the other sort of place, too far. The other sort of place where ethics really comes into sort of research is in the misuse of research results, and the misuse of research results really takes four different domains. So the first is to justify decisions that have already been made. The second would be to safeguard public relations, so the image of a particular, institution. The third would be to appraise staff performance, and the fourth would be to fulfill funding requirements. Those are sort of, like I said, the four misuses of research results. So let's talk about Chapter 7 here real quick, and this chapter deals with research with minoritized and disadvantaged groups. Now, in social work, we're often interested in research with minoritized and disadvantaged groups. We're advocating for people who, for whom no one else is advocating. We're advocating for people who are marginalized, who have special status, that kind of thing. And so really the hallmark of social work is engaging with minoritized and disadvantaged groups. What we sort of need to be aware of is that there is not a whole lot of homogeneity. That's the term the book uses. What they mean is sameness. There's not a whole lot of sameness when it comes to race, gender, geography, immigration status, age. And of course, we could expand this list out to probably 1,000 other things, right? There's not a lot of sameness in a population, when it comes to goals or values or religious orientation or devotion to family or something like that. So social workers are sort of especially sensitive to issues of difference and diversity and things like that. So oops, keep going too far. The sort of things to be aware of when you're thinking about sort of the cultural competence dimension of research is making within and between group comparisons. So if we make a within group comparison, what we're doing is comparing people from the same group, and that can be dangerous to do, especially if that group is very heterogeneous. When we make between group comparisons, we're comparing one group of people to another, and that also might be really dangerous, particularly if one group is advantaged or privileged and one group is disadvantaged. Ethnocentrism refers to the belief that one ethnicity is superior to the other. We have to guard against that in our research. And then we also have to be aware that certain concepts are not equivalent across cultures. So masculinity or femininity or family values, right? A devotion to family, kinship, right? That's all stuff that varies across cultures, and good researchers kind of have an appreciation for that. Social work obviously takes the ecological perspective, which is that person and environment perspective. But that's also sort of a culturally informed way of looking at the world, and not everyone thinks about sort of person and environment. So we even need to be aware of things that we just take for granted in our own profession. And then lastly, mixed methods research is sort of one way to do culturally informed research, or sort of culturally humble research. That way you're collecting many different kinds of data and like we said in the previous lecture, sort of taking care of some of the depth, the lived experience of different cultural experiences. And then of course in all research there is significant socioeconomic influences, and one of the things to really be careful in research is that you're just not repeating socioeconomic studies. We know for example, who tends to be we know, for example, that poverty and poor health tend to go together. We know that poverty and obesity tend to go together. So there's really not much of a reason to sort of repeat that. What there is a need to do is to sort of figure out how to break that cycle. And then, of course, we always need to be careful of researcher characteristics. We've mentioned before kind of the Hawthorne effect, or as I kind of jokingly referred to it, the reality TV effect. People change their behavior when they know they're being watched. And the researcher's presence is going to change a person's behavior. Now, different researchers are going to change behaviors in different ways. Sometimes, I've seen this many times, but sometimes people are trying to impress a researcher. Sometimes people are romantically interested in a researcher. I've seen that happen before. Sometimes, participants themselves have a bias towards a particular group of people, and if the researcher happens to be from that group, well, then the participant and the researcher aren't going to get along. These are all just sort of things about which to be aware and sort of approach with humility. The way we measure, oops, sorry about that. Hit the hot corner on my screen. The way we measure variables can even be a way that sort of harms the cultural humility. We're going to talk about variables here in a couple of weeks, but it's important to make sure we're using language that people understand. Anxiety, for example, isn't necessarily something that translates across languages or across cultures. Sadness or depression isn't necessarily something that translates across cultures or languages as well. There we go. Okay, I just wasn't sure about the animation there. So social work research, like most things, takes this sort of strengths-based perspective when it comes to research as well. So we do an awful lot to increase participation in our research studies. So we do, as I said a couple of minutes ago, we do compensate people for their time. We are respectful of their time and try to take up as much of it, as little of it as is needed to get the information that's important. And then we're always talking about what the utility of our studies are, what we hope will change or accomplish as a result of our studies. And then we always endeavor to sort of understand diversity at a deeper level. We don't stereotype in our research, and we don't reproduce stereotypes. We're very we take great pains to sort of make sure we're not doing that. Oops, keep going too far here. The second thing to kind of think about with respect to a strengths-based perspective in research is the age of potential research participants. So that's another way to sort of engage with diversity. Oftentimes the very young or the very old are left out of research, and so social workers take special efforts to engage different ages. But of course, age is something that could make a person vulnerable or susceptible to sort of undue influence, particularly because age tends to come with economic vulnerability. So people are more likely to be poor at the beginning of their lives or the end of their lives, and that's because they can't work for a variety of different reasons. So for as much as we're trying to engage, we also have to be careful about those populations. We have to be careful with those populations. And then any researcher relationship with participants is something to be not wary of, but safeguarded, I guess, is probably a better word. There's lots of people who engage with communities for years and years and years, and that's because they're trying to do something for that community or help them in some way. But what really we try to guard against in social work is engaging with the community, getting a bunch of data from them, and then hightailing it out of there, hitting the road and sort of dropping that community. So I've done studies, for example, where I've engaged with a community and I've explained what the process is going to look like. So I said I'm going to recruit people for a couple of focus groups for we're looking to do the focus groups around these dates. And then I'm going to need some time for data analysis, but then I want to share the results with you at this venue and this venue and this venue, 6 months after or something like that. And that was a way to sort of keep the community apprised of what the results were and keep them sort of connected to the research. That was actually kind of a cool way to bring it all kind of full circle. Pilot studies is up here because pilot studies are one way to sort of test that our research studies are sort of respecting culture and diversity and difference as well. Let me move myself real quick. So we're always developing sort of new instruments and procedures and to make sure that they sort of translate well across cultures and measure what it is we want them to measure. And this is sort of an ongoing dialogue. There's a lot of people who sort of do this work sort of full time. That's making research sort of more culturally sensitive and aware. Let's talk about evidence-based practice here for a minute. So evidence-based practice is really a decision-making, a clinical decision-making strategy, and we use evidence-based practice because social work really is a science. It's not an art. Although there are perhaps artful elements to it. What we're really doing in social work is using science to intervene with people to improve their lives. And so the important thing to know from evidence-based practice, the important thing to know for the exam would be the steps. I don't necessarily know that you need to memorize them, but you should know where to get sort of an enumeration of the steps, where in the book to get it. And then you should sort of know what the purpose of evidence-based social work practice is. And really the purpose is to make sure that we're basing our clinical decisions on the best available evidence. We're not basing clinical decisions on our opinions or our beliefs or our our wishes, but we're basing it on sort of the evidence. And so ideally, if two social workers working, on the same sort of clinical question, ideally they would arrive at the same answer if they sort of faithfully adhered to the steps of evidence-based practice. So step one is to convert information into kind of an answerable question. Something like that might be, what's the best intervention for a client who has depression and history of traumatic loss or something like that, right? And there's 1,000 sort of examples of kind of answerable questions. Step number 2 is to go to the literature and find the best available evidence to answer that question. So what different treatments have been used with clients who most resemble the client that we're working with. Step number 3 is to critically appraise the evidence for its validity, its impact, and its applicability. So how good is that evidence? Step 4 is to integrate the appraisal of the evidence with your practice experience and your client's strengths, values, and circumstances. So basically what you're doing there is you're figuring out if that evidence really is applicable to the client and your own practice experiences. Step 5 is to deliver the intervention, but then sort of evaluate the effectiveness and figure out how well steps 1 through 4 worked. And then step 6 really is to share that knowledge with others, either through supervision or your own kind of mentoring processes. So as I said, the thing to know with evidence-based practice is really sort of what those steps are. And it's probably okay if you don't memorize them, but you should know sort of where to go and get that information. At any rate, thank you for watching, and feel free, as always, to let me know if you have any questions.